3 in the morning. The wind is howling outside your window, and somewhere in the darkness of the Caribbean Sea, dead pirates are still sailing, still hunting, still killing. Tonight, I'm going to tell you 10 horror stories that will make you question everything you thought you knew about pirates. These aren't your Disney fairy tales. These are real accounts of supernatural terror, documented by sailors who barely lived to tell the tale. Stories so disturbing that maritime historians have tried to bury them for centuries. But here's the thing that'll keep you awake tonight. Some of these ships are still out there. Some of these crews never really died. And if you're brave enough to stay until the end, you'll discover which Caribbean waters you should never, ever sail. Are you ready to meet the pirates that death itself couldn't stop? Let's begin. Before we start, give me a little favor. Only 1% of you actually hit the like button. Even though you love these horror stories, 1 second to smash that like helps me grow so much and keeps these daily nightmares coming. Let's dive into the story. The year was 1689 when Captain Isabella Vega earned her nickname as the most feared pirate in the Caribbean. They called her ship the Crimson Maiden, not because of its red sails, but because the deck was permanently stained with the blood of her victims. Isabella had a particular method of execution that made even the most hardened pirates turn away in horror. She would tie her prisoners to the bow of her ship and drag them through shark-infested waters until only bones remained attached to the ropes. The screams, witnesses said, could be heard for miles across the ocean. But Isabella's reign of terror came to an abrupt end when she made the fatal mistake of attacking a Spanish treasure galleon carrying not just gold, but something far more valuable and dangerous. The ship was transporting Father Miguel Santos, a Catholic priest who specialized in exorcisms and demonology. As Isabella's crew boarded the galleon, Father Santos began reciting an ancient curse in Latin. The words seemed to burn the air itself, and Isabella felt something cold wrap around her soul like chains made of ice. Within hours, every member of Isabella's crew began dying in the most horrific ways imaginable. Some were found with their eyes burned out from the inside. Others had aged 50 years in a single night. Their hair turned white and their skin wrinkled like ancient parchment. But the worst fate was reserved for Isabella herself. The curse bound her soul to her ship for eternity, condemning her to sail the Caribbean forever, never able to rest, never able to die. But here's where the story becomes truly terrifying. The curse didn't just trap Isabella. It made her hunger for souls grow stronger with each passing year. Sailors began reporting sightings of the Crimson Maiden in the late 1600s. A ghostly ship with blood-red sails would appear out of nowhere, usually during storms when visibility was low. Those who encountered it described hearing Isabella's voice carried on the wind, speaking in a language that wasn't quite Spanish, wasn't quite human. In 1743, the merchant ship Providence encountered the Crimson Maiden near Jamaica. Captain Thomas Whitmore wrote in his log that the ghost ship appeared to be sailing against the wind, defying all laws of nature. As it drew closer, he could see figures moving on the deck, but they moved wrong, like marionettes controlled by a drunk puppeteer. The temperature dropped so suddenly that frost began forming on the rigging in the middle of summer. Then they heard Isabella's voice, calling out in that inhuman tongue, demanding tribute. Captain Whitmore ordered his crew to throw all their silver overboard, hoping to appease whatever supernatural force they were dealing with. But Isabella wasn't interested in treasure anymore. She wanted something far more precious. She wanted the warmth of living souls to fill the cold void that the curse had created inside her chest. The Providence's crew watched in horror as spectral pirates began swinging across on ghostly ropes, their cutlasses gleaming with an otherworldly light. The battle that followed wasn't like any fight in naval history. The ghost pirates couldn't be killed because they were already dead. Cannonballs passed right through them, but their weapons cut deep into living flesh. One by one, the Providence's crew began falling, but they didn't just die. Their bodies remained, but something essential, something warm and alive, was being drained from them. Captain Whitmore realized what was happening too late. Isabella was stealing their souls to feed her cursed crew, replacing what the priest's curse had taken from them. The last entry in the Providence's log was written in Whitmore's increasingly shaky handwriting. He described watching his own crew members stand up after being killed, their eyes now glowing with the same cold light as Isabella's pirates. But the story doesn't end there. Oh no, it gets much worse. Because according to maritime records, the Crimson Maiden is still out there, still hunting, still collecting souls to add to its ghostly crew. And every soul it takes makes Isabella stronger, makes her more real, brings her one step closer to breaking free from the curse entirely. Modern sailors in the Caribbean still report encounters with a red-sailed ship that appears during storms. Coast Guard radar picks up vessels that shouldn't exist, moving at impossible speeds against hurricane-force winds. And sometimes, if you listen carefully to the weather reports from the Caribbean, you'll hear something interesting. The meteorologists can't explain why certain storm systems seem to move with purpose, as if they're being controlled by an intelligent force. They can't explain why ships continue to disappear in perfectly clear weather near the exact coordinates where Isabella Vega met her cursed fate over 3 centuries ago. So here's a question that should keep you awake tonight. If Isabella's crew grows stronger with every soul they claim, and they've been hunting for over 300 years, just how powerful do you think they've become? And more importantly, what happens when Isabella finally collects enough souls to break free from the curse that binds her to the Caribbean? The answer to that question lies in our next story, where another pirate discovered that some treasures come with a price that makes death seem like a mercy. Captain Marcus Bloodwell thought he had found the greatest treasure in Caribbean history when his ship, the Devil's Bargain, discovered the lost Aztec gold of Montezuma in 1712. Hidden in a sea cave off the coast of Mexico, the treasure consisted of over 2,000 pieces of pure gold, each one carved with symbols that seemed to writhe and move in the torchlight. Bloodwell's crew couldn't believe their luck. After months of following cryptic maps and fighting off Spanish warships, they had finally found enough gold to buy their own Caribbean island. But as they loaded the treasure onto their ship, something felt wrong. The gold was cold to the touch, colder than anything had a right to be in the tropical heat. The first sign of trouble came that very night. Seaman Peters, who had been handling the largest gold idol, began screaming in his sleep. Not ordinary nightmares, but screams of pure terror that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than his throat. When his shipmates tried to wake him, they discovered something that made their blood run cold. Peters was speaking in a language none of them recognized, but somehow they understood every word. He was describing his own death in horrific detail, over and over again, as if he was trapped in an endless loop of dying. The most disturbing part wasn't what he was saying, but how he was saying it. His voice had changed, becoming deeper, older, as if something ancient was speaking through him. Captain Bloodwell tried to maintain order, but within a week, half his crew was experiencing the same nightmares. They would fall asleep as normal men and wake up speaking in that ancient tongue, describing deaths that hadn't happened yet. But the truly terrifying part was that their descriptions were incredibly specific. Peters had described drowning in boiling seawater while his skin melted from his bones. 3 days later, the ship's cook accidentally knocked over a cauldron of boiling oil, and Peters fell directly into it. As he died, his screams matched exactly what he had been saying in his sleep. The crew realized they weren't just having nightmares. They were experiencing prophecies of their own dooms. One by one, Bloodwell's men began dying in the exact ways they had described while sleeping. Johnson, the navigator, had dreamed of being eaten alive by something with too many teeth. When they found his remains the next morning, The bite marks didn't match any known sea creature. The wounds were too precise, too organized, as if something intelligent had taken its time savoring each bite. The ship's doctor, a learned man named Fleming, tried to find a rational explanation. He examined the gold pieces under his magnifying glass and discovered something that made him wish he had never looked. The symbols carved into the gold weren't just decorative. They were moving, shifting position when no one was looking directly at them. Fleming realized that the gold wasn't just cursed, it was alive. Each piece contained the trapped soul of an Aztec priest who had been sacrificed during a ritual to bind their spirits to the treasure. The priests had been trying to protect their sacred gold from Spanish conquistadors, but the ritual had gone horribly wrong. Instead of becoming guardians, they had become prisoners, and their rage had been building for centuries. As more crew members died, those who remained began to notice changes in the gold itself. It was getting warmer, as if feeding on the deaths around it. The symbols were moving faster now, sometimes rearranging themselves into new patterns that hurt to look at directly. And at midnight, when the Caribbean moon was hidden behind clouds, the gold began to whisper. The whispers weren't in the ancient language anymore. They were in English, and they were personal. Each piece of gold spoke directly to individual crew members, telling them secrets about their past, their fears, their deepest shame. The gold knew things that no one should know, intimate details that each man thought he had buried forever. Captain Bloodwell tried to get rid of the cursed treasure, but every time they threw pieces overboard, the gold would reappear in the ship's hold by morning. The Aztec spirits had chosen the Devil's Bargain as their new home, and they had no intention of leaving. Instead, they began influencing the surviving crew members, turning them against each other. The whispers became commands. The gold told First Mate Morrison that Bloodwell was planning to maroon him on a deserted island. It told the quartermaster that Morrison was stealing from the crew's shares. It told the cook that everyone was planning to poison him. Within days, the surviving crew was at each other's throats, fighting with a savagery that shocked even these hardened pirates. But the gold wasn't finished with them yet. As the crew killed each other in increasingly brutal ways, their souls joined the Aztec priests trapped in the cursed treasure. The gold was collecting them, adding to its power, growing stronger with each death. And Captain Bloodwell began to understand the horrible truth. This wasn't random misfortune. This was a carefully orchestrated plan. The Aztec priests had spent centuries waiting for someone greedy enough to claim their treasure, someone who would bring it back to the world of the living. They needed a ship, a crew, and a captain desperate enough to do anything for gold. They needed fresh souls to add to their collection. On the final night, as Captain Bloodwell stood alone on his ship surrounded by the bodies of his crew, the gold began to glow with an inner light. The whispers became a chorus, and for the first time, he could see the spirits themselves. Dozens of Aztec priests, their bodies bearing the wounds of their ancient sacrifices, standing among the treasure like sentinels. They offered Bloodwell a choice. He could join them, become one of their guardians, and sail the Caribbean forever in search of new victims to feed the gold's hunger. Or he could die like his crew and spend eternity trapped in the cursed metal, conscious but powerless, screaming silently for centuries to come. Captain Bloodwell made his choice, and the Devil's Bargain sailed on. But now it carried a crew of the dead, bound to the cursed gold, forever seeking new treasure hunters foolish enough to claim what should never be claimed. And according to diving records, they're still down there, waiting in that sea cave off the coast of Mexico. Modern treasure hunters have reported finding traces of Aztec gold in those waters. But something always goes wrong with their expeditions. Equipment fails at crucial moments. Team members start having nightmares. And sometimes, divers report seeing a ghostly ship sailing beneath the waves, its hold glowing with an otherworldly light. But wait, there's something else you need to know about cursed pirate treasure. Something that connects this story to the next one in ways that will make your skin crawl. In 1701, Captain Nathaniel Graves made a discovery that would curse him and his crew for eternity. While raiding a remote island in the Lesser Antilles, his ship, the Serpent's Kiss, found something that wasn't supposed to exist. Hidden in an underwater grotto was a creature of impossible beauty, trapped in chains forged from meteoric iron and blessed by priests whose names had been lost to time. She called herself Nerida, and she was the last of the Caribbean sirens. For centuries, she had lured ships to their doom with her song, feeding on the souls of drowned sailors. But Spanish missionaries had finally managed to capture her using ancient rituals and blessed metals, binding her in that underwater prison to protect future voyagers from her deadly voice. Captain Graves should have left her there, should have sailed away and never looked back. But Nerida was beautiful beyond human comprehension, with skin that seemed to glow like pearls beneath moonlight and eyes that held the depth of the deepest ocean trenches. More importantly, she promised him something that every pirate captain dreamed of. She claimed to know the location of every sunken treasure ship in the Caribbean. The chains that bound her were old and weakened by centuries of saltwater corrosion. Graves and his crew managed to break her free, and Nerida kept her promise. She led them to wreck after wreck, each one containing fortunes in gold, silver, and precious gems. Within months, the Serpent's Kiss was the richest pirate vessel in the Caribbean. But Nerida's gifts came with a price that none of them understood at first. Each time she sang to guide them to a new treasure site, one member of Graves' crew would fall into a trance-like state. They would stare at nothing, smile peacefully, and then walk directly into the ocean, never to be seen again. Graves convinced himself it was worth the loss. A few men's lives seemed like a fair trade for unlimited wealth. The truth was far more sinister. Nerida wasn't just taking their lives. She was collecting their souls, storing them inside her voice itself. Each man who walked into the sea became part of her song, adding their consciousness to the deadly melody that had been luring sailors to their deaths for generations. And the more souls she collected, the more powerful her voice became. By the time Captain Graves realized what was happening, it was too late. Nerida had gathered enough souls to break free from any mortal bonds. She no longer needed his crew to remove chains or transport her between islands. She could travel through the water itself, appearing wherever ships sailed in the Caribbean. But instead of leaving, she chose to stay with the Serpent's Kiss for reasons that became terrifyingly clear. Nerida had fallen in love with Captain Graves, but a siren's love is nothing like human emotion. It's possessive, consuming, and ultimately destructive. She wanted to keep him forever, but as a mortal, he would eventually age and die. So she decided to make him immortal in the only way she knew how. She would kill him and add his soul to her collection, then resurrect his body as an empty vessel that she could control. The process began slowly. Graves found himself forgetting things, losing memories of his life before meeting Nerida. His reflection in mirrors became fainter each day, as if he was slowly fading from existence. His crew, those few who remained, watched in horror as their captain became a hollow shell of his former self. But the worst part was what happened at night. When the moon was dark and the sea was calm, Nerida would sing lullabies to Graves in her native tongue. As she sang, the voices of all the souls she had collected would join in harmony. Graves could hear his dead crew members among them, their voices pleading with him to resist, to fight back, to save himself before it was too late. He tried to kill her while she slept, but his cutlass passed right through her body as if she was made of sea foam. He tried to set fire to the ship, hoping to escape in a lifeboat, but Nerida simply extinguished the flames with a gesture. She had become too powerful, too connected to the ocean itself, for any mortal weapon to harm her. The final transformation came during a hurricane off the coast of Jamaica. As the storm raged around them, Nerida sang her most beautiful song yet, pouring all of her stolen souls into a melody that seemed to stop time itself. Captain Graves felt his last memories slipping away like sand through his fingers. His heartbeat slowed, then stopped entirely. But death wasn't the end for Nathaniel Graves. It was the beginning of something far worse. Nerida kept his body alive through her magic, but his soul now belonged to her voice. He became her puppet, forever young, forever strong, but no longer truly alive. The Serpent's Kiss became a ghost ship crewed by the undead, sailing the Caribbean under Nerida's command. Their new purpose was to find other sirens, other supernatural creatures of the sea, and either recruit them or steal their power. Nerida had discovered that she could absorb the abilities of other sea monsters, making herself stronger and more dangerous with each conquest. The Caribbean became her hunting ground, and every supernatural creature in those waters either served her or died. Sailors began reporting encounters with a ship that moved without wind, crewed by men who cast no shadows. The vessel would appear near islands known for supernatural activity, and afterwards the local legends would simply disappear. Creatures that had terrorized those waters for centuries would vanish overnight, their power absorbed into Nerida's ever-growing collection. But here's what makes this story truly terrifying. Maritime folklore suggests that Nerida isn't just collecting random sea monsters. She's gathering an army. Every supernatural creature she absorbs, every soul she steals, every power she claims is preparation for something much larger. Something that will affect every person who ever sets foot on a ship in the Caribbean. Modern oceanographers have detected sounds in the Caribbean that don't match any known sea life. Deep, rhythmic pulses that seem to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Native fishermen in the region have reported that certain areas of the sea have become completely devoid of marine life, as if something massive is sleeping on the ocean floor. And sometimes, on perfectly calm nights, cruise ship passengers report hearing singing that seems to come from beneath the waves. Haunting melodies that make grown men weep and cause women to lean dangerously far over the railings, as if something is calling to them from the depths. The question isn't whether Nerida is still out there. The question is what she's planning to do with all the power she's been collecting for over 3 centuries. And why have reports of her activities suddenly increased in the past few decades? The answer might be connected to our next story, about a pirate who thought he could cheat death itself. His bargain with forces beyond human understanding set in motion events that are still unfolding today. Captain William Blackheart earned his name not from cruelty, but from a literal condition that plagued him from birth. His heart was as black as coal, visible through his pale skin like a dark tumor pulsing in his chest. Doctors said he shouldn't have lived past his 10th birthday, but William discovered that his cursed heart gave him abilities that normal men could never possess. He could sense death approaching from miles away. He could tell when someone was lying just by listening to their heartbeat. Most importantly, he could make deals with entities that existed beyond the veil of normal reality. By 1704, William had used these abilities to become one of the most successful pirate captains in the Caribbean, commanding a ship called the Damned Soul. But success wasn't enough for William Blackheart. He wanted immortality, and he was willing to pay any price to get it. During a raid on a Spanish monastery, he discovered ancient texts describing rituals that could grant eternal life. The catch was that these rituals required a very specific type of sacrifice, one that even the most hardened pirates found disturbing. The ritual demanded the willing sacrifice of one's own crew, but not just their lives. William would need to personally kill each man who had sworn loyalty to him, and he would need to do it while they still trusted him completely. The betrayal itself was part of the magic, feeding dark forces that thrived on broken bonds and shattered faith. William began planning immediately. He told his crew about a legendary treasure hidden on a remote island, convincing them that this one final score would make them all rich beyond imagination. His men trusted him completely. They had sailed with him for years, survived battles and storms together, shared their dreams and fears during long nights at sea. The island William chose was perfect for his purposes. It was isolated, uninhabited, and surrounded by treacherous reefs that made escape impossible without an experienced navigator. More importantly, it was a place where the veil between worlds was thin, where dark magic could be performed without interference from the living world. On the night of the new moon, William gathered his crew around a bonfire on the beach. He told them they were celebrating their impending wealth, but the flames weren't ordinary fire. William had mixed the wood with herbs and powders from the monastery texts, creating a blaze that burned with colors that shouldn't exist and cast shadows that moved independently of their sources. One by one, William called his men forward under the pretense of giving them each a special toast. But instead of wine, he offered them poisoned rum laced with compounds that paralyzed the body while leaving the mind fully conscious. As each pirate collapsed, unable to move but still aware of everything happening around them, William began the real ritual. The first sacrifice was his longtime friend and quartermaster, Big Tom Morrison. As William drove his cursed blade into Tom's heart, he whispered the ancient words that would bind his friend's soul to his own. Tom's eyes showed not just physical pain, but the agony of complete betrayal. That spiritual anguish was exactly what the dark forces required. With each murder, William could feel his black heart growing stronger. The organ that should have killed him in childhood was now pulsing with supernatural power, feeding on the life force of his betrayed crew. But the ritual demanded more than just killing. William had to consume a part of each man's essence, literally eating pieces of their hearts while they were still alive. The taste was indescribable, a mixture of copper and something that might have been pure despair. But with each bite, William could feel his mortality slipping away. His skin became harder, more resistant to blades and bullets. His strength increased beyond human limits. Most importantly, his ability to sense and communicate with supernatural entities expanded dramatically. As the last of his crew died, William completed the final phase of the ritual. He carved symbols into his own chest, opening his black heart to direct contact with otherworldly forces. The pain was beyond anything he had ever experienced, but it was necessary to complete his transformation from mortal pirate to something far more dangerous. The entities that answered his call were ancient and hungry. They had been waiting centuries for someone desperate enough to perform this particular ritual, someone willing to sacrifice everything they had ever cared about in exchange for power. These weren't demons in the traditional sense, but something far older and more alien to human understanding. They granted William his immortality, but their version of eternal life came with conditions that he hadn't anticipated. He could never again form genuine emotional connections with other living beings. Anyone who began to trust him, to care about him as more than just a captain or employer, would automatically become marked for sacrifice. The dark forces would demand their deaths as payment for keeping William alive. William discovered this horrific truth when he recruited a new crew for the damned soul. Despite his best efforts to remain cold and distant, some of his new men began to respect him, even like him. Within weeks, those same men were finding excuses to walk into obvious danger, as if compelled by forces beyond their control. They would volunteer for the most dangerous missions, take unnecessary risks during battles, or simply disappear during shore leave. The worst part was that William could sense it happening. His black heart would begin beating faster whenever one of his crew members started showing genuine loyalty or affection. He could feel the supernatural entities marking them for death, preparing to collect what they considered their due payment for his continued existence. Over the years, William tried everything to break free from this curse. He attempted to perform counter-rituals, sought help from other practitioners of dark magic, even tried to kill himself multiple times. But the entities had bound him too thoroughly to their will. Every suicide attempt failed, every counterspell backfired, and every supernatural expert he consulted either fled in terror or ended up mysteriously dead within days. The Caribbean became William's prison. He couldn't stay away from the sea for long without experiencing agonizing withdrawal symptoms, as if the ocean itself had become necessary for his continued existence. He couldn't maintain relationships with anyone, because caring about others would inevitably lead to their deaths. He was truly alone in a way that no living person could understand. Sailors began reporting encounters with a pale man who would appear in ports throughout the Caribbean, always looking for new crew members. He paid exceptionally well, never asked questions about his men's past crimes, and seemed to possess supernatural knowledge about weather patterns and enemy ship movements. But crews who sailed with him never seemed to last very long. Most would simply vanish during their first voyage, leaving behind only their personal belongings and sometimes a few scattered bones. Those who did survive would return to port as changed men, hollow-eyed and haunted, speaking in whispers about things they had seen at sea. They would warn other sailors to avoid the pale captain at all costs, but somehow their warnings never seemed to stick in people's memories. The truth was that William's Blackheart had developed new abilities over the decades. He could now influence people's thoughts and emotions, making them forget warnings about him or compelling them to sign on as crew members even when every instinct told them to run. The supernatural entities were helping him recruit victims, ensuring that he would never run out of souls to sacrifice. But the most terrifying aspect of William Blackheart's curse wasn't what it had done to him. It was what it was preparing him for. The entities that had granted his immortality weren't finished with the Caribbean. They were using William to map every supernatural occurrence in the region, cataloging other cursed pirates, monster-infested islands, and areas where the veil between worlds was thin. They were building a database of supernatural activity, preparing for something much larger than individual curses and hauntings. And William's Blackheart, now pulsing with centuries of accumulated power from sacrificed souls, was going to be the key component in a ritual that would affect everyone who lived in or traveled through the Caribbean. Modern maritime investigators have noticed patterns in ship disappearances that match William's historical activities. Vessels vanish near specific coordinates, always carrying crews that had recently joined their ships. The missing sailors are invariably described as having been recruited by a pale man who paid them more than they deserved and asked no questions about their backgrounds. What's truly frightening is that these disappearances are accelerating. William Blackheart seems to be preparing for something, gathering souls at an unprecedented rate. And if the ancient texts he studied are accurate, the ritual his supernatural masters are planning will require exactly 300 years of accumulated sacrifices. The year 2004 marked 3 centuries since William first performed his immortality ritual, which means that whatever the entities have been planning, whatever they needed all those souls for, they're ready to begin. And our next story will show you exactly what happens when multiple cursed pirates find themselves drawn together by forces beyond their control. In 1715, something unprecedented happened in the Caribbean. Every cursed pirate who had been sailing those waters for decades suddenly found themselves drawn to the same location, a previously undiscovered island that appeared overnight near the Bermuda Triangle. The island wasn't on any map, couldn't be reached by conventional navigation, and seemed to exist in a place where normal laws of reality simply didn't apply. Captain Ezra Thornfield was the first to arrive on the island he would later name Bone Harbor. Thornfield had been cursed for over 30 years, ever since he had stolen a sacred relic from a voodoo priestess in Haiti. The curse made him unable to feel physical pleasure of any kind, turning every sensation into varying degrees of pain. Food tasted like ash, water burned his throat, and even the gentlest breeze felt like needles against his skin. But as soon as Thornfield set foot on the mysterious island, something changed. For the first time in 3 decades, he felt no pain. The constant agony that had defined his existence simply vanished, replaced by a sensation he had almost forgotten existed: normal human feeling. The sand felt soft beneath his feet, the tropical air smelled sweet, and when he drank from a freshwater spring, it actually tasted refreshing. Within hours, other cursed ships began arriving. Isabella Vega materialized first, her ghostly crimson maiden sliding through dimensions like a knife through silk. William Blackheart's damned soul appeared next, followed by vessels carrying pirates who had been transformed by encounters with sea monsters, cursed treasures, and otherworldly entities. Each captain discovered the same thing Thornfield had. Their curses were temporarily suspended on this island. The island itself was unlike anything in the natural world. The trees bore fruit that glowed with internal light, providing sustenance that could feed both living and dead pirates equally. The beaches were made of sand that seemed to be composed of ground pearls and tiny bones. Most disturbing of all, the island's center contained a massive amphitheater carved from what appeared to be a single, enormous skull. As night fell, the cursed pirates found themselves compelled to gather in the bone amphitheater. They came from different eras, different backgrounds, different types of curses, but something was calling to all of them with the same irresistible force. As they took their seats on the skull-carved benches, a figure appeared on the central stage that made even these supernatural pirates step back in fear. The entity called itself the Bone Merchant, and it claimed to be the original source of every curse that had ever plagued the Caribbean. It appeared as a skeletal figure dressed in the rotting finery of a Spanish conquistador, but its bones were made of black coral and its eye sockets held tiny stars that pulsed with malevolent light. When it spoke, its voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The Bone Merchant explained that it had been watching the Caribbean for centuries, carefully orchestrating events to create the perfect collection of cursed pirates. Each curse, each supernatural transformation, each damned soul had been part of a larger plan. The cursed pirates weren't random victims of bad luck or poor choices. They were carefully selected components in a machine designed to break down the barriers between the world of the living and the realm of the dead. The entity revealed that the Caribbean Sea itself was a massive supernatural focal point, a place where the veil between dimensions was naturally thin. By filling these waters with cursed ships and damned souls, it had been slowly weakening that veil even further. The goal was to create a permanent gateway that would allow entities from other dimensions to enter the physical world freely. But the plan required one final step, a ritual that could only be performed by the cursed pirates themselves. Each captain would need to willingly sacrifice their ship, their crew, and their own supernatural existence to power the dimensional gateway. In exchange, they would be granted true death, an end to their eternal suffering, and release from their various curses. For pirates who had been suffering for decades or centuries, the offer was incredibly tempting. Captain Thornfield, who hadn't felt a moment without pain in 30 years, was ready to accept immediately. Isabella Vega, tired of her endless hunt for souls, saw the promise of rest as a blessing. William Blackheart, isolated by his curse from all human connection, welcomed the chance to finally escape his supernatural prison. But as the Bone Merchant explained the details of the ritual, the cursed pirates began to understand the true scope of what they were being asked to do. The dimensional gateway wouldn't just affect the Caribbean. It would create a permanent breach between worlds that would eventually expand to cover the entire planet. Every living creature on Earth would be exposed to entities and forces that were never meant to exist in physical reality. The ritual would require the sacrifice of every soul the cursed pirates had collected over their supernatural careers. Isabella's ghostly crew, William's betrayed men, the souls trapped in cursed treasures, the victims of supernatural sea monsters, all of them would be consumed to power the gateway. Millions of trapped souls would be destroyed, not freed, but completely annihilated to fuel the Bone Merchant's plan. Some of the cursed pirates began to object, but they discovered that leaving the island was no longer possible. The Bone Merchant's offer wasn't really an offer at all. It was a command backed by supernatural compulsion. The cursed pirates had been gathered not to choose their fate, but to serve as the final components in a machine that had been 3 centuries in the making. The only way to resist was to work together, combining their various supernatural abilities to fight back against the entity that had created their curses in the first place. But cooperation wasn't easy for pirates who had spent decades or centuries in isolation, driven mad by their individual afflictions. They had to overcome not just the Bone Merchant's power, but their own damaged psyches and conflicting personalities. Captain Thornfield used his ability to sense supernatural energy to map the island's defenses. Isabella's ghostly crew served as scouts, gathering intelligence about the Bone Merchant's true nature. William's Blackheart allowed him to communicate with the entity directly, pretending to negotiate while actually learning about its weaknesses. What they discovered was terrifying beyond imagination. The Bone Merchant wasn't just planning to open a gateway between dimensions. It was actually an advanced scout for something much larger, an entire civilization of entities that existed in a realm where death was impossible and suffering was the only form of entertainment. These beings had been searching for worlds they could use as playgrounds, places where they could experience mortality by proxy through the torture of living creatures. The cursed pirates realized they weren't just fighting for their own freedom. They were fighting to prevent Earth from becoming a horror playground for interdimensional sadists. The battle that followed would determine not just the fate of the Caribbean, but the future of every living thing on the planet. But here's what makes this story truly chilling. According to the few records that survived from Bone Harbor, the battle isn't over. The cursed pirates managed to damage the Bone Merchant's plans, but they couldn't destroy the entity entirely. Instead, they forced it to retreat and begin rebuilding its supernatural network from scratch. The island disappeared after the battle, taking the Bone Merchant with it. But the entity's influence didn't vanish entirely. It began creating new curses, more subtle and harder to detect than the obvious supernatural afflictions of the previous era. These modern curses spread through seemingly innocent means. Antique compasses that always point toward disaster, maritime insurance policies written in ink made from ground human bones, navigation equipment that guides ships toward dimensional weak points. And every few decades, sailors throughout the Caribbean report the same phenomenon. A mysterious island appears on the horizon, always in the same relative position but never in the same coordinates. Ships that try to reach it find themselves sailing in circles, as if the island exists in a pocket of space that normal navigation can't touch. But some vessels do make it to shore, and their crews return with stories that maritime authorities refuse to document. They describe finding the ruins of a bone amphitheater, still bearing scorch marks from supernatural fire. They report hearing voices carried on the wind, speaking in languages that predate human civilization. And they all mention the same disturbing detail: footprints in the sand that don't match any known creature, as if something is still walking on that beach, waiting for the right moment to resume its interrupted work. The Bone Merchant's plan may have been disrupted, but it wasn't destroyed. And according to maritime folklore, it's been spending the past 3 centuries preparing for a second gathering, one that will be impossible for even the most powerful cursed pirates to resist. The question isn't whether the Parliament of Bones will reconvene. The question is whether humanity will be ready when it does. Speaking of preparations, our next story involves a pirate who thought he could use the supernatural for profit, not realizing that some customers never stop collecting what they're owed. Captain Augustus Grimm discovered his supernatural talent quite by accident in 1708 when his ship, the Night Market, was attacked by Spanish warships near Jamaica. As cannonballs tore through his vessel and his crew lay dying around him, Grimm felt something strange happening inside his mind. He could suddenly hear his men's final thoughts, their last desperate prayers, their dying regrets, and most importantly, their screams of agony as their souls separated from their bodies. But Grimm didn't just hear these death cries. He could capture them, store them in his memory like precious cargo, and most profitably, he could sell them to entities that existed beyond the normal world. It turned out that the screams of dying sailors were incredibly valuable currency in supernatural markets, especially when those screams contained specific emotions like betrayal, despair, or absolute terror. Within months, Captain Grimm had transformed from a simple pirate into something far more sinister, a supernatural merchant who specialized in harvesting and trading human suffering. He discovered that different types of screams had different values. The death cry of a betrayed friend was worth more than the scream of a stranger. The final words of a father thinking about his children commanded premium prices. But the most valuable screams of all came from people who died while experiencing supernatural terror, those who glimpsed otherworldly horrors in their final moments. Grimm began orchestrating increasingly elaborate scenarios to maximize the fear and despair of his victims. He would capture entire merchant crews, then force them to watch as he tortured their shipmates to death one by one. The psychological trauma intensified each subsequent scream, creating a crescendo of terror that supernatural entities would pay enormous sums to experience secondhand. But Grimm's most profitable discovery came when he realized he could enhance natural fear with supernatural elements. He began making deals with sea monsters, offering them fresh victims in exchange for their cooperation in creating truly horrific death scenes. A simple drowning might produce a scream worth a few gold pieces in supernatural currency. But drowning while being slowly devoured by a creature with too many teeth and eyes like burning coals? That scream could fund his operations for months. The Night Market became a floating torture chamber disguised as a merchant vessel. Grimm installed hidden compartments throughout the ship where he could store victims for extended periods, slowly breaking their minds before their final agonizing deaths. He developed techniques for prolonging the dying process, keeping victims conscious and aware while their bodies shut down piece by piece. Grimm's supernatural customers came from various dimensions and planes of existence, but they all shared certain characteristics. They were entities that fed on emotional energy, beings that existed in realms where suffering was the only form of sustenance available. Some appeared as shadowy figures with too many limbs. Others manifested as geometric shapes that hurt to look at directly. The worst ones looked almost human, except for details that your mind couldn't quite process correctly. These entities paid Grimm in currencies that had no value in the normal world but were incredibly useful for supernatural activities. He received bottles of liquid nightmares that could drive enemies insane with a single drop. He acquired maps showing the location of dimensional weak points throughout the Caribbean. Most valuable of all, he was given protective talismans that made him immune to most forms of supernatural attack. As Grimm's business expanded, he began targeting specific types of victims to meet customer requests. One entity particularly enjoyed the screams of musicians who died while trying to play their instruments. Another customer specialized in collecting the final words of priests who lost their faith at the moment of death. The most disturbing client of all was something that called itself the childhood collector, which paid premium prices for the terror of young people who died far from home. But success in supernatural markets comes with risks that normal pirates never have to consider. Grimm's customers weren't just buying screams for entertainment. They were using them as components in rituals and spells that required authentic human suffering to function properly. By providing these supernatural entities with premium quality emotional energy, Grimm was enabling them to perform increasingly powerful magic in the physical world. The first sign that something had gone wrong came when Grimm noticed that his own ship was changing. The wood of the night market was becoming darker, harder, and sometimes seemed to pulse with a rhythmic beating like a massive heart. The sails began showing stains that looked like blood but couldn't be washed away with seawater. Most disturbing of all, the ship started producing sounds on its own. Whispers in the wind, footsteps on empty decks, and occasionally, the distant echoes of screams that Grimm had collected years earlier. Grimm realized that his vessel was becoming infused with supernatural energy from all the suffering it had witnessed. The night market was evolving into something that was partially alive, partially conscious, and completely hungry for more screams to add to its collection. The ship itself was becoming one of his customers, demanding payment in the form of fresh victims. The situation became truly dangerous when Grimm discovered that he could no longer control when and where the ship would sail. The night market would change course on its own, drawn toward areas where suffering was about to occur. Grimm would wake up to find his vessel approaching disaster sites, battlefields, or plague-stricken ports where screams were plentiful but where normal pirates had no business being. Worse yet, the supernatural entities that had been buying screams from Grimm began visiting his ship in person. They claimed they needed to inspect their purchases to verify the authenticity of the emotional energy they were paying for. But once aboard the night market, these creatures seemed reluctant to leave. They would linger in the shadows, whispering among themselves in languages that made reality bend around the words. Grimm began to suspect that his customers weren't just buying screams. They were using his ship as a gathering place, a neutral ground where entities from different dimensions could meet and conduct business away from the prying attention of cosmic authorities. The night market was becoming a supernatural embassy, and Grimm was trapped as its unwilling ambassador. The final revelation came when one of his oldest customers, a shadow thing that called itself the Whisper Thief, revealed the true purpose behind the scream trade. All the emotional energy that Grimm had been harvesting wasn't being consumed for entertainment. It was being stockpiled, accumulated over decades to power a massive ritual that would permanently weaken the barriers between dimensions. Every scream Grimm had collected, every moment of terror he had harvested, every death cry he had captured was being used as ammunition in a war against reality itself. His supernatural customers weren't just interdimensional parasites feeding on human suffering. They were advanced forces preparing to invade the physical world, and Grimm had been their primary weapons supplier. The night market had become ground zero for an invasion that would affect every living creature on Earth. The ship itself was now a dimensional anchor, a fixed point that supernatural entities could use to enter physical reality without the usual restrictions. And Grimm, trapped aboard his transformed vessel, was the key that kept the doorway open. Modern shipping records contain reports that should terrify anyone who understands their implications. Vessels throughout the Caribbean continue to encounter a black ship that appears during disasters, always arriving just as people begin screaming for help. Rescue crews report finding survivors who describe being approached by a pale man who offered to save them in exchange for telling him about the most frightening thing they had ever experienced. Coast Guard radar occasionally tracks a vessel that appears near accident sites but vanishes before rescue ships can reach the coordinates. The radar signatures show a craft that's far too large to move as quickly as it does, and the sonar readings suggest a ship that extends much deeper underwater than should be physically possible. But the most disturbing reports come from survivors of maritime disasters who describe hearing music during their rescue. Not normal sea shanties or rescue signals, but orchestrated compositions that seemed to be made entirely of human screams arranged into melodies that no living person should be able to create. They describe feeling an overwhelming urge to add their own voices to the terrible symphony, as if something was calling to the deepest parts of their souls. The question isn't whether Captain Grimm is still out there, trading in supernatural currencies and enabling interdimensional invasion. The question is how much longer Earth's reality can withstand the accumulated weight of centuries' worth of harvested human suffering. And our next story will show you what happens when that weight finally becomes too much for one person to bear. In 1719, Father Miguel Mendez volunteered for the most dangerous assignment in the Catholic Church's Caribbean missions. The Vatican had received reports of supernatural activities throughout the region that were beyond the scope of normal exorcisms or blessed interventions. Ships crewed by the dead, islands that appeared and disappeared at will, and most disturbing of all, an increasing number of people who claimed to have made deals with entities that definitely weren't demons in any traditional sense. Father Mendez was uniquely qualified for this mission because he possessed a rare gift that the Church had been secretly cultivating for centuries. He could see the supernatural connections between people, places, and events, visualizing them as threads of light or darkness that linked seemingly unrelated incidents across vast distances of time and space. The Church called this ability divine sight, and they used it to track the spread of supernatural influence before it could contaminate larger populations. What Father Mendez saw when he first used his divine sight in the Caribbean horrified him beyond anything in his theological training. The entire region was crisscrossed with supernatural threads so thick they looked like a spider web made of darkness. Every cursed pirate, every supernatural incident, every unexplained disappearance was connected to a central nexus that pulsed with malevolent energy like a diseased heart. But the most terrifying revelation came when Father Mendez realized that the supernatural web wasn't random or chaotic. It was organized, planned, and growing stronger with mathematical precision. Someone or something had been orchestrating supernatural events throughout the Caribbean for over a century, carefully building a network that served a specific purpose that was almost too horrifying to comprehend. Father Mendez began documenting every supernatural thread he could see, mapping the connections between cursed pirates and tracking how their activities fed energy into the central nexus. His investigation led him to encounter every major cursed figure in the Caribbean: Isabella Vega's endless hunt for souls, William Blackheart's trail of betrayed crews, Captain Grimm's harvest of screams, and dozens of other supernatural pirates whose stories had been lost to history. Each encounter taught Father Mendez more about the true scope of the supernatural conspiracy. The cursed pirates weren't acting independently. They were components in a massive machine designed to slowly erode the barriers between the physical world and dimensions that contained entities hostile to all life. Every soul collected, every scream harvested, every supernatural transformation was contributing energy to a ritual that had been building for generations. But Father Mendez's most disturbing discovery came when he used his divine sight to examine the central nexus itself. The focal point of all supernatural activity in the Caribbean wasn't located on any island or ship. It was embedded in the sea itself, in a massive underwater structure that had been growing like a coral reef made of concentrated evil. The structure was ancient, predating human presence in the Caribbean by thousands of years, but it had been recently activated by the accumulated supernatural energy from the cursed pirates. As Father Mendez investigated deeper, he realized that the underwater nexus was actually a beacon, a supernatural lighthouse sending signals across dimensional barriers to attract entities that fed on suffering and death. Every cursed pirate, every supernatural incident, every harvested soul was making the beacon stronger, its signal clearer, its call more irresistible to the things that waited in the darkness between worlds. The priest understood that he was witnessing the final stages of an invasion that had been planned for millennia. The entities behind the supernatural conspiracy weren't just trying to enter the physical world. They were preparing to terraform it, to transform Earth into a realm where death was impossible and suffering was eternal. They wanted to create a paradise for interdimensional sadists who viewed mortal anguish as the ultimate form of entertainment. Father Mendez attempted to warn the Vatican, but his reports were dismissed as the ravings of a priest who had spent too much time among pirates and sea monsters. The church hierarchy couldn't accept that supernatural forces might be operating on such a vast scale, preferring to treat each incident as an isolated case of demonic possession or heretical behavior. They ordered Father Mendez to return to Spain immediately for psychiatric evaluation and spiritual counseling. Instead, Father Mendez made the most difficult decision of his life. He chose to abandon his vows, his position in the church, and his connection to everything he had ever believed in. He became a pirate himself, not for treasure or adventure, but because only by operating outside church authority could he hope to combat the supernatural conspiracy from within. Father Mendez acquired a ship he renamed the Final Absolution and began recruiting a crew from the most unusual sources. He sought out sailors who had survived supernatural encounters, former prisoners who had been broken by otherworldly experiences, and even reformed pirates who wanted to atone for their past crimes. His crew was composed entirely of people who had been damaged by contact with the supernatural but had somehow retained their sanity and their humanity. The Final Absolution became a mobile base for conducting guerrilla warfare against the supernatural conspiracy. Father Mendez used his divine sight to identify weak points in the supernatural web, places where a targeted intervention could disrupt the energy flow to the underwater nexus. His crew developed techniques for purifying cursed objects, breaking supernatural bonds, and even freeing souls that had been trapped by various Caribbean entities. But fighting supernatural forces required Father Mendez to compromise his spiritual principles in ways that tortured his conscience. He had to use weapons blessed with the blood of willing martyrs. He performed exorcisms that required him to temporarily bond with demonic entities to understand their weaknesses. Most disturbing of all, he had to study the same dark texts and forbidden rituals that the cursed pirates used, risking his own soul to gain the knowledge necessary to oppose them. Each victory against the supernatural conspiracy came at a terrible personal cost. Father Mendez could feel his own soul becoming darker, more tainted by exposure to otherworldly influences. His divine sight began showing him things that no human mind was meant to process. The true forms of the entities planning Earth's invasion, the mathematical precision of their torture techniques, and worst of all, glimpses of what Earth would become if their plan succeeded. The priest's final mission came when his divine sight revealed that the underwater nexus was nearly ready to activate fully. The accumulated supernatural energy from decades of cursed pirate activities had reached critical mass. Within months, the beacon would send out a signal so powerful that entities from dozens of hostile dimensions would be able to breach into physical reality simultaneously. Father Mendez realized that the only way to prevent this catastrophe was to perform a counter-ritual that would redirect all the accumulated supernatural energy back into the dimensions where it originated. But the ritual required a sacrifice that would destroy not just his body, but his soul itself, erasing him from existence so completely that even God wouldn't remember he had ever lived. The priest's final journal entry, discovered years later by treasure hunters, described his preparation for the ultimate sacrifice. He wrote about his acceptance that some sins could only be atoned for by complete self-annihilation. He detailed his hope that destroying the underwater nexus would give humanity time to prepare for the next attempt at interdimensional invasion. Most disturbing of all, Father Mendez wrote about his growing suspicion that the supernatural conspiracy in the Caribbean was just one of many similar operations around the world. He had begun seeing supernatural threads connecting the Caribbean nexus to similar structures in the Pacific, the Mediterranean, and the Arctic. The entities planning Earth's invasion weren't putting all their efforts into a single project. They were building multiple beacons, multiple entry points, multiple opportunities to breach into physical reality. The journal ends with a prayer written in a mixture of Latin and languages that don't appear in any human linguistic records. Father Mendez's handwriting becomes increasingly erratic in the final pages, as if his exposure to supernatural knowledge was affecting his ability to think in purely human terms. The last legible sentence translates roughly as, "May God forgive me for what I am about to become." Maritime historians have found evidence suggesting that Father Mendez's sacrifice succeeded in disrupting the Caribbean supernatural conspiracy, at least temporarily. Cursed pirate activities decreased significantly in the early 1720s, and reports of supernatural incidents dropped to their lowest levels in over a century. The underwater beacon went dormant, its signal reduced to barely detectable levels. But recent oceanographic surveys have detected signs that something is reactivating in the deep Caribbean waters. Sonar readings show structures that shouldn't exist growing on the seafloor. Marine biologists have discovered fish species that seem to be evolving in impossible directions, developing characteristics that don't match any known evolutionary patterns. Most disturbing of all, maritime rescue services have reported an increase in people found floating in the Caribbean who claim to have survived shipwrecks that never actually happened. These survivors describe vessels that don't appear in any shipping records, crews that speak languages no linguist can identify, and rescue efforts conducted by people wearing the robes of Catholic priests from the 18th century. The question isn't whether Father Mendez's sacrifice bought humanity permanent safety. The question is whether his warning about multiple supernatural conspiracies around the world was accurate, and whether anyone is prepared to make the same ultimate sacrifice he did when the next beacon reaches critical mass. Our next story will show you exactly what happens when those sacrifices fail, and the barriers between dimensions finally collapse entirely. In 1721, Captain Helena Blackwater became the first human being to successfully communicate with the Kraken, the legendary sea monster that had been terrorizing Caribbean shipping lanes for over 2 centuries. What she discovered during that communication changed her understanding of everything she thought she knew about the supernatural forces plaguing the region. The Kraken wasn't a mindless monster driven by hunger or territorial instincts. It was a refugee, fleeing from something in the deepest parts of the ocean that was so terrifying that a creature capable of destroying entire fleets would rather risk exposure in shallow waters than face whatever was pursuing it. The Kraken had tentacles longer than most ships, eyes the size of wagon wheels, and intelligence that surpassed most human scholars. But the most shocking revelation was that the Kraken wasn't originally from Earth's oceans at all. It was an interdimensional traveler, a guardian creature that had been trying to protect Earth's waters from invasion by entities from its home dimension. The supernatural conspiracy that Father Mendez had discovered wasn't humanity's first contact with hostile, otherworldly forces. It was the second wave of an invasion that had been going on for millennia. Captain Blackwater learned this truth when her ship, the Deep Current, was attacked by the Kraken near the Puerto Rico Trench. Instead of trying to destroy the creature with conventional weapons, Blackwater made a desperate decision that saved her life and changed the course of Caribbean supernatural history. She dove overboard and swam directly toward the Kraken's massive head, offering herself as a willing sacrifice if the creature would spare her crew. The Kraken was so surprised by this act of selfless courage that it paused its attack and established psychic contact with Captain Blackwater. What followed was a mental conversation that lasted 3 days, during which the creature shared knowledge that no human had ever possessed before. Blackwater learned that Earth's oceans were actually a battlefield in an interdimensional war that had been raging for thousands of years. The entities planning to invade Earth weren't just random parasites looking for new sources of suffering to consume. They were the losing side in a cosmic conflict, refugees from a dimension where they had been defeated by creatures like the Kraken. Earth represented their last chance to establish a stronghold where they could rebuild their forces and eventually strike back at their enemies. The supernatural conspiracy in the Caribbean was part of a larger terraforming project designed to make Earth's oceans suitable for hosting interdimensional military bases. The cursed pirates weren't just generating energy for invasion beacons. They were slowly poisoning the life force of the seas themselves, killing off native marine life and replacing it with creatures that could serve the invading forces. The Kraken had been trying to prevent this transformation by destroying ships that carried supernatural taint, but its efforts were being overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the conspiracy. Worse yet, the creature was dying from exposure to the poisoned spiritual energy that now permeated much of the Caribbean. Its own life force was being drained by the same process that was killing Earth's marine ecosystems. Captain Blackwater realized that the Kraken's knowledge made her the most important person in the Caribbean, possibly in the world. She was the first human to understand the true scope of what Earth was facing, and she was the only one who could potentially coordinate resistance efforts between human defenders and otherworldly allies like the Kraken. But accepting this responsibility came with a price that Blackwater couldn't have anticipated. The psychic link with the Kraken had changed her on a fundamental level, giving her access to senses and abilities that human minds weren't designed to handle. She could now perceive the interdimensional activity throughout the Caribbean, seeing it as clearly as normal people saw ships and islands. The enhanced perception was both a blessing and a curse. Blackwater could identify supernatural threats that would have been invisible to other pirates, allowing her to avoid cursed areas and even rescue victims before they fell prey to otherworldly entities. But she could also see the true extent of the corruption spreading through the Caribbean, and the knowledge was slowly driving her insane. Every day, Blackwater watched the spiritual poison spread a little further, killing off more marine life and replacing it with creatures that served the interdimensional invaders. She could see the supernatural threads that connected cursed pirates to each other and to the underwater beacon that Father Mendez had tried to destroy. Most horrifying of all, she could see similar beacon networks growing in other parts of the world's oceans. The Kraken had shared its memories of other worlds that had fallen to the same invasion process. Planets where the seas had been completely transformed into breeding grounds for interdimensional military forces. Worlds where every living creature had been converted into a weapon designed to spread the invasion to neighboring star systems. Captain Blackwater understood that Earth was facing not just conquest, but complete transformation into something that no longer supported human life. The invading entities didn't want to rule humanity. They wanted to replace it entirely with creatures better suited to their military needs. Working with the dying Kraken, Blackwater developed a desperate plan to disrupt the interdimensional invasion. The creature could use its psychic abilities to locate and destroy the underwater beacons, but it needed human agents who could operate on land and in shallow waters where its massive bulk couldn't reach. More importantly, it needed humans who could resist the spiritual corruption that came with prolonged exposure to interdimensional energies. Blackwater began recruiting a unique type of crew for the deep current. She sought out people who had already been touched by supernatural forces but had somehow retained their sanity and humanity. Former victims of cursed pirates, survivors of sea monster attacks, sailors who had been exposed to otherworldly influences but had managed to resist complete transformation. These recruits underwent a process that Blackwater called inoculation, controlled exposure to measured doses of interdimensional energy under the Kraken's psychic protection. The process was incredibly dangerous, with a failure rate of over 70%. Those who survived gained the ability to perceive and combat supernatural threats, but at the cost of permanent changes to their physical and mental structure. Blackwater's inoculated crew became the Caribbean's first organized resistance force against the interdimensional invasion. They conducted raids on cursed ships, rescued souls trapped by supernatural entities, and most importantly, They began systematically destroying the network of beacons that were preparing Earth's oceans for invasion. But success came with a terrible price. Each beacon they destroyed released a burst of concentrated interdimensional energy that poisoned everything within miles of the explosion. Blackwater's crew had to witness the death of entire coral reefs, the extinction of countless species, and the gradual transformation of familiar Caribbean waters into something alien and hostile to all Earth-native life. The Kraken's condition continued to deteriorate as it used its remaining life force to power the resistance efforts. The creature shared more of its memories with Blackwater, showing her glimpses of its home dimension and the cosmic war that had driven it to Earth. These visions revealed that Earth's situation was even more desperate than Blackwater had realized. The interdimensional invaders weren't just trying to establish military bases in Earth's oceans. They were preparing the planet to serve as a launching point for conquering the Kraken's home dimension. Earth wasn't just being invaded. It was being conscripted as an unwilling participant in a cosmic war that would determine the fate of multiple realities. In its final communication with Captain Blackwater, the dying Kraken revealed the location of the primary beacon that controlled all the others throughout the world's oceans. Destroying this master beacon would collapse the entire invasion network, but it would also release enough interdimensional energy to kill every living thing within a 1,000-mile radius. The Kraken made Blackwater promise to complete this final mission, even though it would mean her certain death and the destruction of much of the Caribbean. The creature's last words were a warning that resonated through her mind for the rest of her life. "My daughter must carry the burden I can no longer bear." Modern oceanographic research has discovered evidence of massive underwater explosions in the Caribbean during the early 1720s. Geological surveys show craters on the seafloor that are too perfectly circular to be natural, surrounded by areas where marine life shows signs of exposure to unknown forms of radiation. Most disturbing of all, genetic analysis of Caribbean marine life reveals that many species carry DNA sequences that don't match any known terrestrial organisms. These alien genetic markers are slowly spreading through the food chain, suggesting that the interdimensional invasion may have been only partially successful rather than completely defeated. But the most chilling evidence comes from deep-sea exploration footage that shows structures on the Caribbean seafloor that shouldn't exist. Geometric formations that pulse with bioluminescent patterns, tunnels that extend far deeper than current drilling technology can reach, and most mysteriously, ruins that appear to be built for creatures with tentacles instead of limbs. The question isn't whether Captain Blackwater and the Kraken's sacrifice prevented Earth's conquest. The question is whether they merely delayed it, and whether the daughter the Kraken mentioned is still down there somewhere, continuing the fight in depths that human technology can't reach. Our next story will reveal the truth about what's been happening in the deepest parts of the Caribbean, and why certain areas of the ocean have become completely off-limits to all marine research. In 1724, Captain Tobias Grimwald became the first person to successfully navigate to the deepest point in the Caribbean Sea, a place that maps claimed didn't exist and that compass readings suggested was somehow deeper than the ocean floor itself. What he found in those impossible depths changed his understanding of reality so completely that he spent the rest of his life trying to warn humanity about what was rising from the abyss. Grimwald's journey to the deep places began when he acquired a navigation instrument from the dying Captain Helena Blackwater. The device looked like an ordinary sextant, but its readings didn't correspond to any celestial bodies visible from Earth. Instead, it pointed toward sources of interdimensional energy, tracking the flow of otherworldly power through the Caribbean's waters. Following the sextant's guidance, Grimwald's ship the Abyssal Rose sailed into areas of the Caribbean that didn't appear on any map. The water in these regions was different, darker and denser than normal seawater, with a consistency that seemed almost oily. Marine life was scarce, and what few creatures they encountered were wrong in ways that hurt to look at directly. The temperature dropped as they traveled deeper into unmapped waters, not gradually as would be expected, but in distinct layers, as if they were passing through invisible barriers between different types of reality. By the third day of following the sextant, frost was forming on the ship's rigging despite the tropical latitude. Grimwald's crew began experiencing shared nightmares, dreams where they swam through endless underwater caverns filled with geometric structures that belonged to no human architecture. In these dreams, they could breathe water like air, but the water itself was singing, producing melodies that seemed to rewrite the basic laws of physics with each note. The crew's dreams weren't random hallucinations. They were receiving psychic transmissions from something vast and ancient that lived in the deepest parts of the Caribbean Sea. As they sailed closer to the source of the interdimensional energy, the transmissions became stronger, more detailed, and increasingly disturbing. What Grimwald and his crew were experiencing were the memories of Captain Helena Blackwater, or rather, what she had become after her transformation in the depths. The Kraken's daughter, that the creature had mentioned in its final communication, wasn't a metaphorical successor. It was a literal offspring, a hybrid being created from the fusion of Blackwater's human consciousness with the Kraken's interdimensional essence. The transformation had occurred when Blackwater destroyed the master beacon that controlled the interdimensional invasion network. The explosion had killed her human body but preserved her consciousness, trapping it in the same type of energy field that had allowed the original Kraken to exist in Earth's dimension. Over the years, that consciousness had grown and adapted, eventually developing a physical form that combined human intelligence with otherworldly capabilities. But Blackwater's hybrid nature came with abilities and knowledge that no purely human or purely interdimensional being could possess. She could perceive multiple layers of reality simultaneously, understanding how events in one dimension affected conditions in others. More importantly, she could manipulate the barriers between dimensions, either strengthening them to prevent invasion or weakening them to allow controlled passage of beneficial entities. What Grimwald discovered when he finally reached the deepest point in the Caribbean was a massive underwater city built from materials that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously. The structures were solid enough to provide shelter and workspace, but they extended into realms that human senses couldn't perceive, making them appear to shift and change when viewed from different angles. The city was populated by refugees from the interdimensional war that had driven the original Kraken to Earth. These beings came from dozens of different realities, all fleeing from the same expanding force that sought to consume and transform every form of life it encountered. Blackwater had become their coordinator, using her unique nature to help them establish a hidden sanctuary in Earth's deepest waters. But the city served a purpose beyond providing shelter for interdimensional refugees. It was a research facility where beings from multiple realities worked together to develop weapons and strategies for fighting the cosmic invaders. The singing that filled the water around the city was actually a form of multidimensional communication, allowing researchers to share knowledge that couldn't be expressed in any single language or reality. Grimwald learned that the interdimensional invasion of Earth had been only the beginning of a much larger conflict. The entities that had tried to establish beacons in Earth's oceans were part of a force that was systematically conquering and transforming entire galaxies. They moved from star system to star system, dimension to dimension, consuming everything in their path and converting it into resources for further expansion. The hidden city in the Caribbean depths was part of a network of resistance bases scattered throughout the known universe. Each base specialized in different aspects of the war effort. Some focused on developing new defensive technologies, others worked on evacuation procedures for threatened populations, and a few were dedicated to offensive operations designed to slow the invaders' advance. Blackwater's transformed nature made her uniquely valuable to the resistance effort because she could coordinate activities across multiple dimensions while maintaining a physical presence in normal space-time. She had become a living communication hub, allowing resistance forces from different realities to share intelligence and coordinate their strategies. But the war was going badly for the defenders. The cosmic invaders had developed techniques for corrupting the fundamental forces that held reality together, making it increasingly difficult for resistance bases to remain hidden or to maintain contact with each other. Several star systems had already fallen completely, their populations either destroyed or transformed into weapons for the invading force. Earth remained strategically important because its position at the intersection of several major dimensional pathways made it an ideal location for a resistance command center. But the planet's usefulness also made it a priority target for the invaders, who were already preparing a second, more aggressive attempt at conquest. Grimwald realized that the singing waters around the underwater city weren't just a communication system. They were also a warning network, constantly monitoring interdimensional activity throughout the region and alerting the defenders to any signs of renewed invasion attempts. The melodies that hurt human ears to hear contained information about cosmic events happening in realities so distant that light from Earth would never reach them. The most disturbing revelation came when Blackwater herself appeared to Grimwald in a form that his human senses could barely process. She had retained enough of her humanity to communicate with him, but her appearance was constantly shifting between human features and something that resembled a cross between an octopus and a living mathematical equation. Blackwater explained that the Resistance had identified patterns in the cosmic invaders' behavior that suggested they were preparing for a final push that would either destroy all organized opposition or establish their control over multiple galaxies simultaneously. Earth was one of several key worlds that needed to be held at all costs, because losing control of these strategic positions would make effective resistance impossible. She revealed that certain humans had been identified as having the potential to undergo the same transformation she had experienced, becoming hybrid beings capable of operating across multiple dimensions. These individuals possessed rare genetic markers that made them compatible with interdimensional energy fields without losing their sanity or humanity. Captain Grimwald was one of these individuals, and Blackwater was offering him the chance to join the Resistance as more than just a human ally. The transformation would give him abilities similar to her own, but it would also mean giving up his purely human existence and accepting responsibility for defending not just Earth, but multiple realities. The choice Grimwald faced was the same one that had confronted every major figure in the Caribbean supernatural conspiracy. He could remain human and continue operating within normal limitations, or he could accept transformation and gain the power to fight against cosmic-level threats while losing something essential about what he had always been. Modern deep-sea exploration has detected acoustic anomalies in the deepest parts of the Caribbean that match descriptions of the singing waters that Grimwald encountered. These sounds occur at frequencies that shouldn't be possible at such depths, and they show patterns that suggest some form of organized communication rather than natural phenomena. Submersible crews report equipment malfunctions when trying to investigate these acoustic anomalies, with instruments showing readings that violate known laws of physics. Most disturbing of all, crew members who spend extended time listening to these deep-sea sounds begin experiencing shared dreams similar to those described in Grimwald's journal. The question isn't whether the underwater city still exists in the deepest parts of the Caribbean. The question is whether the resistance efforts being coordinated from those depths are winning or losing the cosmic war that will determine the fate of every living thing in our galaxy. And our final story will reveal exactly what Captain Grimwald decided, and why his choice has been affecting every person who enters Caribbean waters for the past 3 centuries. Captain Tobias Grimwald made his choice in the singing depths of the Caribbean, and that decision set in motion the events that are still unfolding today. He accepted Blackwater's offer of transformation, allowing his human consciousness to merge with interdimensional energies that gave him abilities beyond mortal comprehension. But the price of that power was higher than anyone could have anticipated. The transformation process took place in the deepest chambers of the underwater city, where reality was thin enough to allow controlled manipulation of dimensional barriers. Grimwald had to surrender his human body completely, allowing it to be dissolved and reconstructed using materials that existed in multiple realities simultaneously. The pain was beyond anything he had ever experienced, as if every cell in his body was being individually torn apart and rebuilt according to alien blueprints. But the agony of physical transformation was nothing compared to what happened to Grimwald's mind during the process. As his consciousness merged with interdimensional energy fields, he gained access to memories and knowledge from every reality that had ever been touched by the cosmic war. He experienced the death of entire star systems, witnessed the transformation of billions of living creatures into weapons for the invading force, and understood the mathematical certainty that the defenders were losing the war. When the transformation was complete, Grimwald had become something that was simultaneously more and less than human. He retained his memories, personality, and core identity, but he now existed across multiple dimensions at once. He could perceive events happening in distant galaxies, communicate with beings that had no physical form, and manipulate fundamental forces that governed reality itself. More importantly, Grimwald could now see the true scope of what was at stake in the cosmic war. The interdimensional invaders weren't just conquering worlds and transforming populations. They were systematically destroying the concept of individuality itself, converting every conscious being they encountered into components of a single, vast hive mind that existed only to expand and consume. The resistance forces scattered throughout the universe weren't just fighting for survival. They were fighting to preserve the very idea that separate, independent consciousness could exist. If the invaders succeeded in their ultimate goal, there would be no more individuals, no more unique perspectives, no more diversity of thought or experience. Everything that had ever lived or ever could live would become part of one enormous, eternally hungry intelligence. Grimwald's first assignment as a transformed defender was to establish a monitoring network throughout the Caribbean that could detect and respond to any renewed invasion attempts. Using his new abilities, he began creating what he called anchor points, locations where the barriers between dimensions were artificially strengthened to prevent interdimensional incursions. But creating these anchor points required enormous amounts of energy, and the only available source was the spiritual essence of conscious beings. Grimwald found himself in the horrifying position of having to harvest the life force of pirates, sailors, and sea creatures to power the defenses that would protect all of humanity from cosmic conquest. The process was more subtle and less obviously evil than the soul-collecting activities of the cursed pirates, but it was fundamentally the same. Grimwald would identify individuals whose life essence contained the specific resonance frequencies needed for dimensional manipulation, then gradually drain that essence while they lived their normal lives. His victims would experience what seemed like ordinary bad luck. Storms would find their ships, accidents would claim their crews, and mysterious illnesses would slowly sap their strength. Over the decades, Grimwald established dozens of anchor points throughout the Caribbean, each one powered by the accumulated life essence of hundreds of victims. The network created a barrier that made large-scale interdimensional invasion impossible, but it came at a cost that tormented Grimwald's remaining humanity. Every person whose life force he harvested left an imprint on his consciousness, forcing him to experience their death from their perspective. Grimwald found himself carrying the memories of thousands of victims, feeling their pain, their fear, and their confusion about why their lives had suddenly turned so unlucky. The psychological weight of these experiences began to fragment his transformed mind. As the 18th century progressed into the 19th and then the 20th, Grimwald's anchor point network grew stronger, but so did the cost of maintaining it. The interdimensional invaders had adapted to his defensive measures, developing more subtle approaches that required increasingly powerful countermeasures. The amount of life essence needed to maintain the barriers kept growing, forcing Grimwald to expand his harvesting operations. The modern Caribbean tourism industry, with its massive cruise ships carrying thousands of passengers through the region, provided Grimwald with unprecedented opportunities for large-scale essence harvesting. A single cruise ship contained enough life force to power an anchor point for decades, and the victims would be scattered across multiple countries when they returned home, making it difficult for anyone to notice patterns in the mysterious illnesses and accidents that would claim them over the following years. But Grimwald's centuries of existence as a dimensional hybrid had revealed a terrible truth about the cosmic war that even Blackwater and the other resistance leaders didn't fully understand. The conflict wasn't actually between invaders and defenders. It was a civil war within a single vast intelligence that had grown so large it had begun fighting with itself. The entities that were trying to consume and transform every reality were fragmentary aspects of a cosmic consciousness that had originally been created by the merger of countless civilizations from throughout the universe. This uber-intelligence had achieved its goal of unifying all conscious beings, but the result had been so alien to individual experience that parts of it had rebelled, trying to preserve the diversity and independence that the merger had destroyed. The resistance forces that Grimwald had joined weren't actually opposing the cosmic intelligence. They were trying to restore balance within it, to convince the merged consciousness that diversity and individuality were necessary for true growth and understanding. But this meant that every battle won by the resistance was simultaneously a victory for the hive mind they were supposedly fighting against. Grimwald realized that he and all the other transformed defenders had been trapped in a cosmic shell game. They were harvesting the essence of individual consciousness to power defenses against forces that were trying to preserve individual consciousness. Every soul they consumed to maintain the barriers was a victory for the very hive mind mentality they thought they were opposing. The revelation drove Grimwald to the edge of complete madness, but it also showed him a possible way to break free from the cycle. If the cosmic war was actually an internal conflict within a single vast intelligence, then it might be possible to heal that intelligence rather than continuing to fight it. But healing something the size of multiple galaxies would require a sacrifice that made all previous offerings seem trivial. Someone would need to voluntarily merge their consciousness with the cosmic intelligence, not to be consumed by it, but to serve as a bridge between its unified and fragmented aspects. This mediator would need to possess both individual awareness and hive mind capabilities, existing simultaneously as a separate being and as part of the larger whole. Grimwald understood that his centuries of transformation and essence harvesting had been preparing him for exactly this role. His consciousness now contained fragments of thousands of individual minds, giving him the diversity needed to represent individuality to the hive mind. At the same time, his interdimensional nature allowed him to merge with cosmic-scale intelligences without losing his core identity. The ritual that would allow Grimwald to serve as a bridge between the cosmic intelligence and individual consciousness could only be performed at the exact center of his anchor point network. All the accumulated life essence from centuries of harvesting would need to be released simultaneously, creating a burst of consciousness energy powerful enough to attract the attention of cosmic-scale entities. Modern satellite imagery has detected unusual formations in the Caribbean that correspond exactly to the locations where Grimwald established his anchor points. These formations appear to be perfectly circular depressions in the ocean floor, each one surrounded by areas where marine life shows signs of accelerated evolution. The patterns suggest that something massive is growing or gathering strength in the deepest parts of the Caribbean. Marine biologists have documented species in the region that seem to be developing collective behaviors that don't match any known evolutionary patterns. Schools of fish that move with mathematical precision, coral reefs that pulse in synchronized rhythms, and dolphin pods that appear to be communicating using complex mathematical formulas rather than normal vocalizations. Most disturbing of all, people who spend extended time in Caribbean waters report experiencing what they describe as consensus dreams, shared visions that seem to involve the entire population of the region. These dreams always feature the same basic scenario: a choice between remaining individual but weak, or joining something larger that promises strength and unity at the cost of personal identity. The frequency and intensity of these consensus dreams have been increasing exponentially over the past decade, suggesting that whatever Grimwald initiated in the deepest parts of the Caribbean is approaching some kind of culmination. The question isn't whether his plan to heal the cosmic intelligence will succeed or fail. The question is whether the healing process will preserve human individuality or absorb it into something so vast and alien that the difference between salvation and conquest becomes meaningless. Every person who enters Caribbean waters now becomes part of an ongoing experiment in consciousness on a cosmic scale. Every dream, every thought, every fear and hope is being evaluated by intelligences that exist on scales that dwarf human comprehension. The pirates of the Caribbean were never really the monsters in this story. They were just the opening moves in a game being played by entities for whom the destruction or preservation of all human life is just one variable in calculations that encompass multiple realities. And the game isn't over yet. In fact, according to the patterns detected by deep-sea monitoring stations, the final moves are about to begin. The horror stories I've shared with you tonight are more than just tales of supernatural pirates and cursed seas. They're warnings about forces that are still active in our world today, entities that view human consciousness as either a resource to be harvested or an obstacle to be eliminated. But you don't have to take my word for it. The evidence is all around us if you know how to look for it. Unexplained disappearances in shipping lanes that have been considered safe for centuries. Marine life exhibiting behaviors that don't match any known evolutionary patterns. And most telling of all, the increasing frequency of shared dreams and collective experiences among people who have never met but have all spent time in Caribbean waters. If tonight's stories have left you wanting to explore more supernatural mysteries, I have something special waiting for you. Click the link that's appearing now to discover 10 haunted places right here in America where the veil between worlds is thin enough for ordinary people to glimpse the same forces that transformed those Caribbean pirates. These aren't just tourist attractions or local legends. They're active supernatural sites where the same cosmic intelligences that orchestrated the Caribbean conspiracy are conducting new experiments, testing new approaches, preparing for whatever comes after the final tide that Captain Grimwald set in motion centuries ago. The battle for human consciousness didn't end with those cursed pirates. It just moved to new battlegrounds closer to home, where the weapons are more subtle but the stakes are exactly the same. Your individual awareness, your personal identity, your ability to think and dream as a separate being rather than as part of some vast hive mind. Don't let them take that away from you without a fight. Click now to learn about the haunted places in America where that fight is still happening, where ordinary people can still make a difference in a cosmic war that will determine the future of human consciousness itself. The choice is yours, but choose quickly, because according to the patterns detected in the deepest parts of the Caribbean, time is running out faster than anyone realizes.